Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's lecture. I'm really delighted to see so many people here in person and also a lot of people joining us online, including members of Roger's family. So it's really fantastic. So many of you are able to make it. My name's Alison Park, and I am the interim executive chair of the Economic and Social Research Council here in the UK. But more importantly, for tonight's purposes, I'm also an old colleague and friend of Roger Jowell's. So before we begin and before I introduce our fantastic speaker, I wanted to say a few words about why we're here and why this lecture series began. So this is the 9th lecture, believe it or not, for those of you who've been coming for a while, in a series that began back in 2014 as a memorial to the late Sir Roger Jowell. Roger, as I'm sure many of you know, died in 2011. He was an outstanding British social scientist, statistician, and academic. He co-founded Social and Community Planning Research, SCPR, now NatSen, Social Research, back in 1969. He later established the British Social Attitudes and co-directed the British Elections Survey, still going strong today, and we'll hear some data from at least one of those studies later on. Roger cared deeply about the practice of social research, founding the Social Research Association in 1978, and was very committed to the value and the proper use of data and statistics, serving as the deputy chair of the board of the UK Statistics Authority from 2008. And last, but by no means least, he also had an enduring interest in the development and the value of robust comparative social research. This saw him help found the ISSP, the International Social Survey Programme, back in the mid-1980s. And then later on established the European Social Survey, whose headquarters has been based here at City University of London ever since, our host tonight. As The Guardian said in Roger's obituary, his studies of British social attitudes over time and in comparison with other European countries amassed a trove of social knowledge. And very fittingly tonight, our speaker, Professor Rosie Campbell, will be delving into that treasure trove of social knowledge. Professor Campbell is Professor of Politics and Director of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College London, which she joined in 2018. Her publications cover subjects including voting behaviour, public opinion, the politics of diversity, and political recruitment. She's recently written on barriers to participation in politics, gendered patterns of support for the populist radical right, and what voters want from their elected representatives, a very topical topic. She was the principal investigator of the ESRC-funded representative audit of Britain, which surveyed all candidates standing in the 2015, 2017 and 2019 British general elections. She's a familiar voice on radio, either as an interviewee or as a presenter. So in terms of the format, Rosie's going to speak for 40 minutes. We'll then have up to 30 minutes for questions. Those of you joining us online, do please post those questions in the Zoom and we'll make sure that we refer to them later on. Attendees here in the room in person are welcome to join us for a drink afterwards in the pavilion area on the ground floor of this building. A few practicalities before I pass over to Rosie. So there is no planned fire alarm. If there is an alarm, the nearest fire exit is the route you use to get here. So out of these doors, left, and then down the main stairs, and then assemble in Northampton Square. And then finally, I just wanted to thank the organisers and indeed the funders of tonight's event, 3 organisations who are all very closely connected to Roger: NatSen Social Research, the Social Research Association, and City University of London. So on that note, I will pass over to Professor Rosie Campbell, who's going to talk to us about gender and voting behaviour and the importance of women electors in the next election.
Thank you so much. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here to speak to you tonight, and a real honour. I was really delighted to be asked. I didn't know Sir Roger Jowell, but I know his legacy very well, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak to you and to celebrate that legacy. And I also looked at the list of previous speakers, one of whom is in the audience, much to my consternation, Sir John Curtis. So difficult questions await, I imagine, but I feel very honoured to have this opportunity to speak to you. And I'm going to get on one of my hobby horses. I have been looking at studying the question of gender and voting behaviour since I started my PhD research, which was 22 years ago. And at the time, I was really puzzled about why was there a well-known gender gap in terms of party of support in the US and not one in the UK. So in every presidential election in the United States since 1980, a greater proportion of women than men have voted for the Democratic candidate and vice versa for the Republicans. And yet that didn't translate into British politics, where we also have a two-party system. We had very similar political context, and yet we didn't see the same trend. So that question's been puzzling me for a long time, and we're going to look at that. And I'm going to ask why more attention hasn't been paid to women voters, particularly in recent years. And obviously, I've chosen this title somewhat before recent events. And as Sir John pointed out to me, as we met at the doorway, women voters are probably not going to decide the next election if the current polls hold out, because a huge majority of people will be voting Labour, men and women. So any gender gap may not make much of a difference, but polls can change. And I think, you know, with 2 years between now and the election, certainly if I were a party strategist, I would want to know the contents of what I'm going to be sharing with you tonight. So Alison's already mentioned the enormous contribution that Sir Roger Jowell made and his contemporaries made to the essential infrastructure that allow us to answer questions like these. For me, looking at the aggregate gender gap between men and women really requires a couple of things that you can only really do with high quality data of the kind that Sir Roger Jowell championed. In order to look at gender gaps in a meaningful way, we need to compare different groups of women and men, because women and men are such enormous components of our societies, and women differ from each other as much as they do from men and vice versa. And so we need to have data with sufficient sample size where we can look down in subgroups of men and women. We can compare generations, we can compare social classes, we can compare potentially where sample size permits ethnic minority subgroups. We also need really robust data, which is randomly sampled, so that we can actually have reliable analysis. And then I think crucially, it's incredibly important that we had, for the British election study, actually collects validated vote data, so that actually you don't just say whether you've turned out to vote, actually check, did you turn out and vote? And some of my early analysis that I undertook 20 odd years ago, I discovered that men at that time were slightly more likely to say they had voted, but when you dug into the validated vote, there was a very small trend for them perhaps not to have done quite at the same rate as they had reported. So having that validated vote was really crucial for really checking, are these gender gaps actually real, or are they artifacts of the way we describe our own behaviour? So before I proceed, I'm basing this lecture very heavily on these two papers that I wrote with my colleague, Rosalind Shorrocks, who also calls herself Rosie. We're both Rosalinds. And I want to acknowledge her contribution to the papers that I'm presenting today. I've also really stripped out the modelling, because I think, you know, sometimes when I present this work in academic conferences, I've got all the graphs up, and it's perhaps not the most entertaining. It's great for good feedback on how to improve your models, but what I'm going to focus on here is what we found out. These papers are already published. I don't want you to tell me what's wrong with them right now. So the first paper that I'm looking at is Finally Rising with the Tide. And this really looks at this historical trend that I described. Why has the UK not been up with the US in terms of this gender gap? And we were looking at the 2019 election and seeing what, you know, has the UK finally caught up with this global gender generation gap? And then another piece that is more kind of outward facing rather than academia facing, about women voters taking the wheel and really looking at the 2017 and 2019 elections in a holistic way. So I want to start in this lecture by setting the UK gender gap in international context and demonstrating that until 2017, the UK was something of an outlier among high income nations. That the global trend for women to move to support parties of the left did not reach the UK for some reason. As women entered paid employment and higher education, Norris and Inglehart's theory about the global gender generation gap was that women would look to the state to provide services that they were no longer providing themselves, potentially childcare, that they would focus on health, on education, on welfare provision. Also, the theories are that as divorce rates rose, that women became more financially vulnerable and therefore looked to the state to protect them. I'm a bit suspicious about that because I think women were disproportionately always financially more vulnerable. Perhaps it was less obvious in terms of divorce rates, but women were always precarious in that way. And then I'm going to focus on, I know that actually some of you will be sitting on your hands and be quite furious with me for a little while, because I'm going to focus on the two largest parties in the UK for the first part of the lecture. That does not mean that I have not noticed that there is Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland. It's because if we take this historical sweep, that has been the focus, the two-party comparison, and I want to put that in context. And then I really want to focus on the role of electoral context, because the gender gap theory that has proliferated, if you search on Google Scholar for gender vote gaps, there's now an enormous literature that really focuses largely on the US, but has expanded outside of the US. But I feel that it really is primarily a sociological account, and it's very powerful and it's very persuasive, but it fails to give very much space for electoral context. And I think when I've been trying to puzzle through why there was no modern gender gap in the UK, it seemed to me that too little attention was being paid to the electoral context in which a gender gap could manifest itself. And as part of that understanding of the electoral context, I'm going to look at gender gaps and issue positions and how they can change with what's salient at election time. And this will finally take me to a point where we consider what are the likely issues, main salient issues at the next election likely to be. And of course, we've all been very bad at predicting that recently, but I'm going to take a stab and then think about to what extent they're likely to be gendered. And I think from where we're standing now, they're highly likely to be gendered, but I also think that could change, and I'll explain how. So this is a figure from Norris and Inglehart's 2000 book, The Developmental Theory of the Gender Gap. And this is where they argue about the emergence of a modern gender gap in high-income countries. And they argue that as women's moved into higher education and paid employment, actually a modern gender gap emerges. And they argue that the traditional gender gap is one where women are more likely to support parties on the right or conservative parties than men. And they argue that's to do with, in traditional societies, women's greater religiosity and their lack of exposure to some of the socialization that pushes men to the left in the workplace, in trade unions, for example. And they identify three discrete phrases described as part of this rising tide: the traditional gender gap, realignments, and the modern gender gap. And this is this graph that illustrates. You see, you've got Turkey at the bottom, which they would argue was a traditional society with traditional gender gap, women more likely to vote on the right. And you see the US is kind of towards the top with more women voting on the left. It's a very compelling story. And yet I've circled Britain here, and actually I was in Australia last week, so I've circled Australia as well, because Britain and Australia both, I would have thought, meet the criteria for Norris and Inglehart's modern gender gap. They're both countries in which women have moved into paid employment and higher education. And yet we don't see, what we actually see is a realignment in terms of the traditional gender gap gradually disappearing, but the modern gender gap doesn't emerge. So that the transition period just becomes sustained over a long period in the UK. Why would that be? Why is the UK an outlier? Well, as I've already mentioned, I don't think this account of linear progress is flawless. I think it's incredibly helpful for us to think about what the trends shaping men's and women's lives have been and how men and women's lives may differ. I personally am not of the view that there's necessarily anything essentially different between men and women, but what we're sure about is there are and have been significant differences in men's and women's lived experiences. And the developmental theory of the gender gap really makes the most of that, rather than making any essentialist claims about women's innate nature or men's innate nature. It talks about what do men and women's lives look like, and when they change, what is the impact on political attitudes and political behaviour. Some of the problems with this theory is obviously internationally, it can be very difficult to classify parties into clear left and right categories. So it's one of those approaches where the US is kind of used as the gold standard, and then everywhere else is tested along the same axes. It can be very difficult to apply in a sectarian context. I have a former PhD student who's just published a book on gender and voting in the Palestinian territories, and shown that women are more likely to support Hamas than men. But when she digs into that, it's actually because Hamas have a reputation for providing greater social services. So actually some of the trends that might push women to vote to the left in a political context where economic left-right is the main continuum, or the axis that the parties are spread across, could be quite different in a situation that is politicized along different axes. I think another feature that is ignored is the role of party polarization. And this to me is the critical point about context. So what are the motivating factors that might push men and women to support different parties? Well, I think that the sociological theories talk about actually the policy demands of men and women. They don't necessarily, that there has to be a further stage, a further linkage to take that into party choice. So in the US, if we think about the period since 1980, when the modern gender gap emerged, it's been characterized by increasing polarization and now hyperpolarization along a number of issues. And those issues are very often highly gendered in terms of public attitudes. So if we think about abortion, gun control, small state, these issues really tend to divide men and women. But in the US, not in a very simple cross-cutting way. In fact, it's more complex, that Southern religious women actually tend to hold more conservative attitudes on many of those positions than Southern religious men. But professional women in northern states actually are to the left of men. So when you look at the divide, it's actually quite it's polarized along four categories. But what happens is it manifests itself in an overall gender gap that hides this division by subgroups, so that actually we see this modern gender gap where a greater proportion of women are voting for Democratic candidates, which is hiding the way that subgroups actually, subgroups of men and women differ. And that takes me back to my point why this high quality data is so important, because if we want to scratch beneath the surface and understand what's driving them, it's differences in lived experiences, and the different lived experiences of Southern religious women who are more likely to be not to be university educated and not in paid employment are very different from those women who have had a very different life experience and vote for the Democrats. So where does this take us back to the UK? Well, this was my research life story, at least part of it, until very recently. So I wrote a PhD and a book and a number of papers on gender and voting behaviour, and also have diversified into studying a lot of different topics, partly because it was very difficult to get anyone to see that this was at all interesting. And the reason for that is, look at it. I mean, what has happened over time is that there was a traditional gender gap in the past, and this is, I should say, this is two-party Conservative and Labour gender gap, adapted from Norris's study in 1999, and then I have continued it on until 2015 here, calculating in the same way. And what you see, most of the differences in the post-1970 period are not statistically significant. And what I did in my thesis was dig down below the surface and discover that this aggregate level, not much going on, was hiding quite a lot of subgroup difference. So Norris wrote a paper in 1999 showing that actually supporters of New Labour young women were disproportionately in that group, but they were counterbalanced by older women who still were more likely to vote Conservative. So it looks like no difference, but actually that's hiding this generational difference. And Norris and Inglehart's theory was that, okay, we're now on a trend that the post-1945 cohort and those following them are going to follow this modern gender gap, and we're just a bit behind them. So we can see these cohorts following behind, and eventually they will catch up. But it didn't emerge. And I think this is where the role of context is incredibly important, because if we think about 2005, that's the first election that David Cameron was leader of the Conservative Party. And he chose to make his first speech as party leader in the old Equal Opportunities Commission. And the two of the issues that he focused on was getting more Conservative women onto the Conservative benches in the House of Commons, and tackling issues like work-life balance and childcare. So I personally believe that he really tackled New Labour head on. New Labour, I saw in my PhD, have been very successful in recruiting the votes of a really targeted subgroup of women voters. I had to do so much digging down into the data to see what was driving the gender gap amongst younger voters that Norris had identified. And it was professional women who were mothers. So there was a really key subgroup who I think traditionally would have been Conservative voters, but voted Labour in the New Labour period. And that, I think, we're going to get to that in a minute, but it's to do with the issues that New Labour stressed: education, 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 the health service. And it's harder to prove any connection with who the Labour MPs were. So there's been quite a lot of research looking at, if you put a woman candidate forward, does that mean women vote for that candidate? And I know that with our third woman Prime Minister, there's been a lot of discussion in the media about, does this affect women voters? I have to say that there's very little evidence that it makes much difference. Party almost always comes first. And I've done some research with a colleague, Oliver Heath, where we found that the only women who can be tipped over to be more likely to vote for a woman in the UK are women who score very highly on a feminist index. So they really identify as feminists, and they might then tip to vote for one party because it's got a women candidate. But my feeling is that party strategists are usually not ignorant of what makes a difference to voters. And when Tony Blair was elected in 1997, I don't know if you remember him being donutted by the women MPs who had been selected behind him, the record number of women MPs. I think getting at how party image can be gendered is quite difficult, but we know that education and health were key priorities for voters. I also think seeing a face that looked very different from the Conservatives at that time, when they were only 9% women MPs, will have made a difference to party image that perhaps is quite difficult to tap with survey questions, but I think probably did matter in some indirect way. And David Cameron, when he became leader of the Conservative Party, really explicitly tried to take that on. And I don't know if you remember that he deployed an A-list at that time, and he had an A-list of candidates where there were 100 candidates, 50% men, 50% women, and with, I can't remember what the proportion, but a much more representative proportion of ethnic minority candidates than would typically be the case. And when he first instituted that rule, the top target seats had to choose from that 100. And there was a huge backlash at the time, but a certain number of selections were made, and then he watered it down and candidates could come from elsewhere. And I think one of the things that we're seeing inside the modern Conservative Party when we see a more diverse slate of MPs is the legacy of that A-list. And I think David Cameron might well have believed that was the right thing to do. But I also think he was aware that the party image compared to New Labour was not one that perhaps was very attractive to women voters and potentially ethnic minority voters too. And so my argument in some of my work is that party polarization on gender equality didn't disappear, but it was much more, it was much less apparent during that period. We've got the Labour Party and the Conservative Party actively competing to be seen to be more progressive on gender equality. And then if you then roll that onto the situation in the United States, I think it could hardly be more different. If you think about how integrated women are into the Republican Party versus the Democratic Party and the way issues of gender equality are treated. So to me, it seems if we think that salient issues are the issues that tend to help party sorting, in the UK, gender issues were not salient because there wasn't party choice around them, is my argument, or the potential argument. So what happened next? Well, this to me is a moment of enormous excitement. Bear in mind, I've been banging away at this for, nearly, at this point, nearly 20 years. Oh, I'm pressing the wrong. Ta-da! This is a moment for me. I mean, actually, if I think about this from a normative point of view, probably the previous slide was better, because actually, do we want to see gender gaps? Are they a normatively good thing? If both parties are actually equally trying to promote gender equality and gender is not a salient issue, maybe that actually is a better thing for the health of democracy. But for getting papers published and getting people interested in what you're doing, the little red tick is fantastic. So in 2015, women were, for the first time, more likely to vote for the Labour Party than men. And we get this positive modern gender gap emerging. The figure masks gender gaps within subgroups again, but what we see is that gender generation gap that Norris identified in 97 has moved up to the under 50s in this period. Now, when I ran for the last few elections prior to this, so in 2010 and 2015, there were some news stories looking at polling research saying that there was a gender gap of this kind. And then when I went and looked at the British election study, I found no such thing. And so I felt a little bit cautious that it was just an artifact of the fact that the data perhaps wasn't as good quality as the British election study data. It didn't have the same sample size, and it wasn't as robust. Perhaps some of the issues I've mentioned around validated vote could have made a difference. So I was very cautious when I saw those news stories saying we'd had a gender gap. So in 2017, when I ran this analysis, I was really intrigued, but I was also a little bit cautious. Has Norris and Inglehart's modern gender gap really emerged in the UK? Is that going to be a long-term trend? Or is it a feature of the 2017 election? And I felt at the time there were a number of reasons to think it could be something that was a feature of that election. I've mentioned party polarisation already. Well, that was a very polarised election, wasn't it? There was really clear blue water between the two largest parties. Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party, and despite the fact that the election was so close to the EU referendum, it really became an election around public spending cuts and austerity. And I had seen over a period of time, when you looked at public opinion towards spending cuts, it was one of the areas that is gendered. So there are lots of areas where you see very little difference between men and women, but classically through this whole period that we have data, women are more likely to say that they will support higher taxation if it's to be spent on public services, and they're more hostile to public spending cuts. So this seemed like a perfect scenario for a gender gap to emerge when you have got, this is the issue that's most salient, and you've got the two parties taking very different positions on the issue. And I undertook some analysis with Rosalind Shorrocks, and a colleague called Anna Sander at Manchester University ran some analysis as well, all trying to understand what were the root causes of this gender gap. And if you look at those papers that I referenced earlier, you'll see the modelling, and you can explore that. And what we discovered was, yes, economic attitudes were the key to explaining the gender gap at that election. So that led me to question, well, what happens in the next election if economic attitudes are not so salient? Ta-da! Again, yay! And it's exactly the same. I promise I didn't copy and paste. This is still not proof that we're going to see the red all the way through, but it's certainly, we see a very similar pattern. And what can explain this? Well, the analysis that I've undertaken and other colleagues have undertaken looking at 2019, it's really intriguing to me, because when we've run the models, the economic pessimism of women no longer is a key explanation in 2019 for this gender gap. This election was all about Brexit, wasn't it? The 2019 election. And when I was kind of thinking about this in advance of the election, that led me to anticipate that there may well be no gender gap. because at the EU referendum, there was absolutely no difference between the proportion of men and women who voted to leave or remain. I mean, it's really absolutely negligible. And yet that was curious to me, because when I started doing my research, if you looked at the 2001 British election study and you looked at the most important issue, the only people who said the most important issue was Europe were men aged about over 50. And that salience of Europe stayed within that age group until prior to the referendum itself. So you would think that this is an area that could be very gendered. If you think of support for the Brexit Party, or UKIP was typically 2/3 male. It's intriguing that when we get to the referendum, it disappears. And my feeling about it is, actually, in one of the papers with Rosie Campbell, we go through all the different items around attitudes to the EU. And what we see that makes sense to me is that it's the strength of feeling around EU exit where you see the gender difference. So if you think about those people who are really hard Brexiteers, they are disproportionately men. And women were more in the group who hadn't quite made their mind up about how to vote in that referendum, and they were persuaded closer to the time. And so when we then come to this 2019 election, yes, when it came to the vote in the Brexit referendum, there wasn't much gender difference. But in 2019, the people who really passionately felt that they wanted a hard Brexit were disproportionately male and older men. What Rosie Shorrocks and I found when we dug down into the data was that actually there was really quite a big gender gap in terms of feelings about the EU amongst younger men and women, with younger women being much more in favour of softer Brexit or even rejoining the EU. And that really shaped this gender gap that emerged in 2019. Contrary to my expectations, I would have said to you that attitudes to the EU at that point, having looked at the 2016 referendum, were not particularly gendered. And yet actually, again, it's the salience of the issue. It's how passionately you feel about it that made the difference. So we see 2017 economic differences between men and women, particularly generational economic differences, led to this gender gap. And then in 2019, generational gender gaps in terms of attitudes to the EU really explain this difference. And to me, this illustrates the fact that it's interesting to me that this never reached public attention to the level I would expect. I'm sure all of you were very well aware of the youth quake stories in the last election. And yet our analysis shows that at least to some extent, that youth quake was shaped by gender, and significantly so. We didn't really hear that story. And yet it was so significant that we actually see it at the aggregate level. I recently spoke at an event where I was the only neutral commentator with 3 conservatives, and not one of them was actually aware of the gender gap that disadvantages the Conservative Party at the moment. That was astonishing to me, because one of them was a Conservative pollster. It doesn't seem to be an issue that has resonated. And yet, if we've now had 2 elections with this level of gender gap, I just find that astounding, and I can't quite understand why I'm not getting through. But anyway, this is an attempt. So another reason why parties really ought to pay attention. And John, I take your point that, you know, if the current polls are borne out over the next 2 years, undecided voters may not be the most important category in the election. But if the election gets closer, women are almost always overrepresented amongst undecided voters. This is one of those cases where, you know, gender gaps that draw attention in the US are often 5 percentage points. But you can see here that when it comes to making up your mind who to vote for at election time, the really between 1/5 and 1/4 of women actually hadn't made their mind up during the campaign itself, compared to just 1/10 of men. And when you look into this further, it tends to be because women tend to be slightly less interested in politics than men. And the more interested in politics you are, the more likely you're to have a preferred party or to have a sense of partisanship who you're going to vote for. And that isn't necessarily because women are just disaffected. Research has shown that when there are more women in politics, actually women's interest in politics can increase. So when my boss, Julia Gillard, was the Prime Minister of Australia, during the period she was in office, young women's interest and knowledge in politics actually rose. Sadly, it went down again when she went out of office. That lack of interest might be partly to do with the historically male coding of party politics, but certainly undecided women are a key part of the swing voters that parties need to target at election time. And so the differences in preferences and priorities between men and women are thus extremely important if you want to think about electoral strategy. Again, I think they're much neglected. So returning to my point about age, and I just want to thank the other Rosie for producing this pretty graph. It's now well known that age is one of the most important cleavages cross-cutting the British electorate. And of course, if we think back to the time that Sir Roger Jowell was writing, we have the huge debates about the extent of class de-alignment. And I think, in these last couple of elections, class de-alignment really seems to have been, indisputable. But what has come to the fore is age. But this realignment, where age has become one of the most significant underlying predictors of vote, is actually driven to quite a considerable extent by gender. I think I've illustrated that point enough. But I'd like to return to my point about context from here. So this isn't the prettiest graph in the world, table in the world, but the reason I want to share it is I think we had quite a unique opportunity in 2019 to look at party support in very different electoral contexts, because we had the EU elections where we were asked to go and vote for candidates who were never going to serve or deliver anything for us. And so the way we weigh who we're going to vote for in terms of competence and delivery was completely excluded from that election. And we typically often used to talk about European elections as being second order elections and an opportunity to give the government perhaps a kicking or to vote with your heart rather than your head. I think 2019 was perhaps even a third order election. There was absolutely nothing at stake at all. You could really do whatever you wanted. And here, I think it's really interesting where you see the pattern. So in 2017, and of course, this is the aggregate level rather than the age where you see bigger gender gaps. But in 2017, you can see that a greater proportion of women than men voted Labour. And the same is true in 2019 general election. But actually, if we look to the 2019 Euros, that gender gap in support for the two main parties is absolutely negligible. And where we do see a difference is we see a 5 percentage point difference between men and women in support for the Brexit Party and a 4 percentage point difference between men and women in support of the Greens. And again, if you break that down by age, those gender gaps are larger amongst the younger cohorts. So this to me really illustrates the important role of context. So it might be the same underlying attitudinal and issue positions that are generating these gender gaps. Women have historically put more emphasis on environmental issues. Men have historically put more emphasis on the EU question. And yet how that manifests itself in terms of party support depends on the order of the election, and also, what the electoral system is, etc. And so to me, this really illustrates how the sociological account of the gender gap is very good at explaining differences in issue positions, value positions, but is less good at explaining how they translate into party support. Oh, I've gone the wrong way. There we are. Okay, so this is taking me to John's point, really. So where are we now? Well, we're 2 years out from the next election, and of course, anything could happen. But we do know that at least at present, the Labour Party are quite far ahead in the polls. I think that would be reasonable to say, historically far ahead in the polls. And we do see a gender gap that is at present there, with a greater proportion of women saying that they would vote Labour. I take John's point that actually there's so many men, that what difference does it make? But I think it does highlight the fact that this gender gap looks like it might be here to stay. So I'd like to take us back to the point about the issues that underlie these gender gaps that we can see emerging. So first of all, I'm looking at some Ipsos Mori data from February 2020. And here you can see that there is a gender gap in terms of attitude into this. So this is, can you pick up to 3 of the most important issues facing the country? And you'll see that 10 percentage points higher more women saying that they are concerned about the NHS, hospitals and healthcare. That's a classic gender gap that we would expect to see. And then we see exactly the same thing in reverse when we look at one of the most important issues being EU, Europe, the Brexit, common market. So that's exactly, if you were over the whole period that I've been studying these questions, that's exactly what you would expect to see. But what about the following year? It appears to have completely vanished because the most salient issue of the day is coronavirus. Now, personally, I think if you then dig down into what people's concerns are around coronavirus, you might still see those differences. So it might be that women are more concerned about the health impacts, maybe men are more concerned about the economic impacts. But what I'm illustrating here is what tends to happen is that gender gaps can only shift behaviour when they're salient. And actually during the Great Recession, nearly everyone said the economy is the most important issue, and gender gaps didn't appear. So I'm now switching to, I wanted to be consistent and look at Ipsos Mori, but they hadn't got recent most important issue data. So I've gone to YouGov, and you can see here that the economy, 73% of men and women both have said that the economy is one of the most important issues facing Britain today. No great surprise. But actually, if you look at attitudes to health, we've got what I would call quite a huge gender gap. We've got 16 percentage point difference between men and women. And actually, when we look at family life and childcare, although it's only a 5 percentage point difference, it's actually double the proportion of women raising this issue as men. And then when we're looking at Britain leaving the EU, a 7 percentage point difference. So even though the economy is such a huge important factor for everyone, these underlying gender differences are still apparent. So what could that possibly mean for the next election? Well, if all things being equal, if we were to have an election tomorrow, we've seen what the likely polling results are, and I would anticipate that gender gap that we've seen in the last election would remain, and again would be higher amongst younger generations. But what could happen to change that? And I think there are some questions. If taxes and public spending are the key issue, as they certainly are at the moment, then we'd expect to see that gender gap. But what if the context changes? And I really hope it doesn't. But if Vladimir Putin were to do something absolutely horrendous and security was to be the #1 issue, would the gender gap disappear? Would actually there be a situation in which an issue where there isn't such a huge difference between men and women dominates, and actually we don't see that gender gap? I also think the issue of competence is not one that's especially gendered. So I think it's probably uncontroversial to say that the recent budget could have been handled better. I think, if that reputational damage isn't rectified, then you wouldn't expect, if that's the key issue, to see that leading to a gender gap, which I think perhaps is John's point, that if everybody wants a change, we don't see the gender gap emerging to quite the same extent. So prediction is not my forte, but to conclude, the modern gender gap has emerged in the UK, with a greater proportion of women supporting the Labour Party than men, and a smaller proportion of women voting Conservative. But it's not my prediction that necessarily is inevitably always here to stay. We tend to look at, in this field of research, we tend to look at the US as a model, but the US is one in which the political context is incredibly polarized around these issues. And we have a political context where the political parties have a history of sometimes competing on issues where men and women differ. The gender gap is underpinned by a substantial gender generation gap. And I think that's something that's very much overlooked in the coverage of the role that age plays in our party choice. The gender gap shifted significantly during 2019 from a pro-Labour advantage among women and a pro-Conservative advantage amongst men. In the EU referendums, it was a pro-women advantage for the Greens and a pro-men advantage for the Brexit Party. So there's no inevitability between the attitudinal differences between men and women and the parties they vote for. There are significant differences in the issues men and women prioritise, but I've chosen to show you where the differences are. You could spend a lot of time looking through the data showing where there are no differences between men and women. And I think that's the key point, that actually where we see differences is often about the strength of feeling rather than the issue position itself. And the electoral context also shapes that. To what extent is the issue something that is a focus of a minority who are really galvanized around it, and what extent does it become part of the mainstream debate? So all of this combined with women's overrepresentation among swing voters means that I believe that gender gaps are critical to the outcomes of our elections, even if they are all too often overlooked.
Okay, so in that case, a huge thank you to Rosie for what I think was both an incredibly interesting and stimulating lecture, and also one that I think was just perfect given why we're here. And particularly your sort of observations about the importance of studies like the British Election Survey and these huge social science infrastructures that I think are so important in this country.